Hi everyone, it's Heather Taddy. I research and investigate all things paranormal, and I've been doing so in the public eye, trapped in your television since 2006. I've always had a never-ending fascination with spiritualism, ghosts, aliens, UFOs since I was a child, which I'm sure all the presenters can relate to. I always tell people that once you enter this world of the paranormal, it's really hard to escape. And the fact that we still don't really have all the answers, I think makes us want to search even more. For those of you that don't know me, in the early 2000s, I was part of a paranormal investigation team at Penn State University called PRS, Penn State Paranormal Research Society. Our client cases became the basis for a television series on A&E called Paranormal State. Since then, I have co-hosted Travel Channel's Alien Highway with Chuck Zukowski, Portals to Hell with Jack Osborne, and Mysteries Decoded with Jennifer Marshall. And I also film and produce a YouTube series with Katrina Weidman called Travel the Dead. Today, I'm going to talk about the psychological aspect of experiencing unknown or bizarre activity. I'm going to talk about the importance of the interview process, especially in this field, because a lot of times we are relying on firsthand witness accounts. And lastly, I'm going to share some of my most interesting interviews and cases with you. Since pretty much the beginning of recorded history, people have been having experiences that are sometimes considered to be unexplainable. All natural explanations have been ruled out. It's considered to be paranormal. Other times, some instances are deemed paranormal when in fact, you yourself are causing the activity by either your unconscious mind causing things to occur without you being aware. You could be projecting repressed emotions of hostility and anger and actually causing things to move psychokinetically, which we are all capable of doing. Other times, you could outwardly be manifesting physical trauma. In other instances, you have people that have experiences where they're not really holding on to rational thought and they want things to be paranormal when in fact they're not. I think the paranormal can have such an interesting grasp on people that a lot of times if someone has a personal problem, saying that it's paranormal is oftentimes easier than fixing their own problem. Either circumstance, whether it's good or bad, can leave a really lasting effect on an individual, believer or not. You know, sometimes these experiences can challenge your beliefs, especially UFO encounters, close encounters. You know, your worldview is greatly affected. And oftentimes, if you do have a bizarre experience you can't explain, you tend to replay the situation over and over in your head. And you ask yourself, why did I experience this? How did I experience this? Who am I going to tell that's not going to think I'm insane? And, you know, it's these experiences stick with you. They really have an effect on you. As investigators, we put a lot of emphasis and attention on the specific activity that a client is experiencing. I think a lot of the times, the ways in which the client is personally affected is often overlooked. I don't think we put enough attention on that, at least in the public eye. I saw the psychological aspect of a haunting play out when I was taking on cases with PRS in college. We would get emails on a daily basis from terrified families who were having very genuine experiences that they couldn't explain. You know, a lot of times they would be afraid to sleep in their own house. They would move out of their house because the activity was so intense and they just didn't know what to do. So they would call us in. We would travel all over the US and go to these families' houses. You know, we would stay the night, we would stay for several days and just try to help them figure out what was going on and try to find a rational explanation or, you know, a unexplainable explanation for what they were experiencing. There's one particular case that always stands out to me that I think truly shows how when you experience this activity, I think it can really have an effect on you. And I think for some people, it can have a bigger effect on them and it can sort of overtake them in a way. We did an investigation in PRS that was filmed for Paranormal State concerning a woman named Carol Ann. She was living in New York. She had recently lost her mom and sister, so she was going through a lot of grief. She moved into this house, and once she moved in, she started to notice that things felt a little off. She decided to consult a psychic, and the psychic told her that there was a woman named Mary who hanged herself in her garage, and that's who she had been communicating with. We were able to document this, and the client, Carol Ann, was obsessed with, she had an analog microcassette recorder, and she would, on a regular basis, she would turn it on and ask questions and get really, really out of this world EVPs, like complete thoughts, complete sentences. It sounds like something on a different frequency. A woman is communicating with Carol Ann. She had tapes and tapes when we went there and we listened to them. And honestly, they were some of the best EVPs I'd ever heard. She was getting so obsessed with trying to help this spirit move on, which, we don't even know if we have the capability as humans to do that. First of all, we don't even really have a grasp as to what spirits are. If they're recordings that are embedded in the environment, we don't know what any of this stuff is yet. So she sort of let this overtake her. She found herself withdrawing from her friends and family. She thought that she could help this spirit, and she felt she really connected with it. And other people had experiences there. We had one of the uncles that stayed the night in this house actually left in the middle of the night because he felt hands try to lift up his body when he was sleeping on the couch. That sort of really opened up my eyes to see that, okay, whether or not this is really happening, whether or not some of it's explainable, some of it's not, the people that are going through it, it's a really genuine experience to them. And sometimes it can really change your life and affect your belief system. And with Carol Ann, it was definitely like overtaking her life. I remember when we were also there, we were setting up and we were setting up our equipment and conducting an investigation. She was in her room recording the movie Sixth Sense off of the television onto a VHS tape. And she would rewind it and play it back. And she claims that she would even pick up voices. So that case to me is a very perfect example of how, sure, you're having an experience, but oftentimes people don't really see how the person becomes very affected by it. As an investigator, interviewing is such an important skill set to have. We rely on firsthand witness accounts. Of course, without witness accounts, we have nothing. So, you're on a location, you're interviewing previous homeowners, you're interviewing ranchers who have experienced cattle mutilations. They go in their house, they experience some type of paranormal activity. So you're interviewing all kinds of people. You're talking about hard topics. You're talking about suicides. You're talking about deaths. Interviews can get really personal. So it's really important to be able to have that ability to make the client feel really comfortable so that they can open up to you. We come across incredible, almost unreal claims, and it's our job to confirm or deny through our investigating and research if these things are really happening. I have found that sometimes clients have lied during interviews. They'll hide personal details that are relevant to a case. And sometimes you have to interview someone multiple times. I've had times where I've had to interview a client like 3 or 4 times, and then finally they're like, oh, I used to practice devil worship and I never really closed that door. Now it's affecting me later in life. So you just have to know the right questions to ask. I'm a really friendly person. I talk to everyone. Everywhere I go, I'm always talking to everyone. And I think that interviewing is really easy for me because I have that down-to-earth personality and people feel comfortable talking to me. So oftentimes I will talk to someone who's not directly involved in a case. They're just someone that's like hanging around at a particular location. I'll start talking to them and asking them questions to see what, they might say to me. And one particular case I did on Alien Highway explored the rumor that someone on a ranch adjoining the Foster Ranch hid debris in a cave on their property. Chuck Zukowski and I went to this man's house. This guy named Red, I believe his great uncle is rumored to be, the person that at that time, he was a young boy, he was like 14 or 15. And when the Corona crash happened, he actually hid debris on this property in a cave. So we went to this guy's house and he showed us this area that actually looked like it was a huge area that looked like it was once a cave, but it had been blown up. And he told us that his grandmother, one of his relatives, when he was young, would always tell him to kind of stay away from that area and would always be really, suspicious of anyone going around that area. So this guy claimed that there were up to 7 caves on his property. We started digging. We actually found a cave. And once we got closer, we felt a breeze coming from this cave. We noticed a hole in the ground. We started digging. We put a camera in, and this hole started getting bigger and bigger. And then once we started getting closer, this man came to kind of check out what we were doing. And all of a sudden he was like, I don't want this getting out to my family. I think that you guys should stop. And I was thinking to myself, why did you have us go there in the first place if this was going to be on a national television show? So I was kind of really bummed out about that. But the point of my story is I had to go into this guy's ranch house to use the restroom. And I remember in between scenes, his girlfriend had pulled up in her car and she was sitting in the car. I was talking to her, I was introducing myself. And I decided to ask her some questions. And I remember asking her, what do you know about these caves? What have you personally heard? And she said, oh, in our basement, my boyfriend, the owner of this ranch, has been digging out a hole in his basement because we think one of the caves connects to the basement of this ranch house. So she revealed this to me and I was like, really? And then I remember thinking, I went into their house several times to use the bathroom, and I remember the door to the basement. And in my head, I wanted to go down there and find out if this was really true and if they were really digging a hole and they really knew where one of these caves were, but they didn't want it out to the public. The owner of the ranch came over, Red, and I went up to him and I told him what his girlfriend told me. And he got so mad, and he immediately turned to her and was like, you weren't supposed to tell them that. So things got real awkward real fast, and we couldn't obviously explore that. But, in my head, I was like, I could have just walked in there. And could you imagine if I just walked in there and opened that basement door and went down into their basement and discovered this huge cave and found a piece of the debris from the Corona crash? That's a total dream. But again, that's an example of talk to everyone at a location. Even if they're not directly involved, you don't really plan on interviewing them. Maybe they haven't directly experienced the phenomena. You should always talk to everybody because you never know what piece of information someone will be ready to tell you. So I've worked on a variety of different cases. I've worked with families who were really afraid to sleep in their own home. I've seen families sleeping in one room with the lights on. I've seen families move out of their house because they were experiencing such frightening activity that was the only thing they could think of to do, was to just leave a house that they really loved. I've talked to so many people that have been hesitant to share their story for fear of ridicule. There's still that fear of ridicule where people are scared to share their stories, and that can psychologically affect you as well. Maybe they've told one person in their whole life. Maybe, they just want validation, and to them, their experience is genuine. It's really unique to me to see how people react differently to this stuff and how our personal beliefs affect the experiences that we have. That's always been really fascinating to me, often more fascinating than the activity that they're experiencing. I've also seen people experience activity that's completely changed the path of their life. Skeptics have an experience that they can't explain, and I've seen it completely change their life, change their path in life. Dr. Lynn Katai, who of course, she witnessed the Phoenix lights and she was able to catch it on 35 millimeter film. I remember having a discussion with her about how she was a doctor, and then once she experienced seeing the Phoenix lights, she had to stop her practice and find the answers as to why this occurred. It was such an intense and overwhelming experience for her that she changed her whole career path. There's another case that I worked on where the client's sanity was greatly affected. The family would come home and they would find that all of their religious items would be knocked off of their shelves. And this happened several times. Another time they came home, every light in every single room was on, their TVs were on, their radios were on. And it got to the point where they thought, is someone breaking into my house? Like, there's no possible way anyone's breaking into my house. There's no evidence. Then their bank accounts got hacked. On Good Friday, the husband claimed that a boot flew across the room and hit him in the head. They started to experience health problems that they couldn't explain. And all of this seemed to coincide with a particular item that they brought into their house. And I remember we did rounds and rounds of interviews with these clients to try to figure out, was it an object that they brought into their house, or was it something personal going on? Like, there has to be something that happened around the same time that they started experiencing this activity, because they had never experienced it before. So we found out that one of their friends gifted them a voodoo doll from New Orleans. The voodoo doll had a heart on it with a line through it and a dollar sign with a cross through it. So we did some research on the doll, and we realized that the doll was negative to hex someone. So here this family had this voodoo doll. They kind of put it in a drawer and forgot about it. But we were able to pinpoint their experiences to around the same time that they brought this doll into their house. They consulted a priest, and the priest told them to simply just remove the doll from their house. I don't think he really gave them specific instructions on exactly what to do. So the clients decided to burn the doll in their burn pit in the back of their house. So really, once they burned the doll, that's when things started to amp up, which they just really, when they burned the doll, they just released all this negative energy. When we were there, one of our investigators saw a black shadow, and someone else also witnessed a toolkit that was hanging on the wall by a nail. They witnessed this toolkit lift up and slam back down onto the wall. I think we actually caught it on film too. So we took this doll and we performed a binding ceremony with it. We buried metals on their property, and then we followed up a couple months later and all the activity had stopped. I'm going to talk about Roswell again because we all know that when it comes to UFO cases, this is the holy grail. On Alien Highway, Chuck Sikowski and I, we got to interview Sandy Proctor, which Sandy Proctor is Dee's younger brother. Dee was 12 years older than Sandy. And to me, to be able to interview one of the Proctors, even though he wasn't alive, when the crash at Corona happened, it was still really interesting to hear his take on things, especially, what his mother had told him. Because of course, Loretta had handled the memory metal. So when we asked his description of the memory metal, it's always remained the same. So that was pretty cool to hear that coming from him. And Sandy told us that his parents had a couple different UFO sightings right before the 1947 crash. And he described those to us. Sandy discussed how Dee wasn't really interested in the wreckage Because if you think about it, he pointed out how there was always debris on ranches all the time. There's always just junk lying around. So he didn't really think much of it at that time. Being a little kid, it probably wasn't a big deal to him. The military combed the area. They tried to get every little last piece. Sandy cleared up the rumor that the Proctors were holding on to some of the debris. He thought that was pretty ridiculous when we had asked it. Mac was told not to talk about it, which we all know, and they set him up at a meat locker near an Air Force base. So that was all confirmed. We got to take Sandy to the actual debris site that Chuck had the coordinates for. He got from Glen Dennis. That was really cool to see him there and just see him looking around. And I remember I got a picture of him like examining the rocks and picking them up. So that was a really cool experience to be a part of. I remember at one point, we had conducted the interview at Sandy's house, and I remember going into his house. We had lunch in there, and I remember going in and seeing that classic framed photograph on the wall of the whole Proctor family, and you could see Dee with his like cowboy hat, and that was really cool to see. And they also had this like replica of the ranch house right below it. So that was just like a really memorable interview for me, because I felt like at this point it was kind of the closest to get to the actual source. My last interview that I'm going to share is someone I think that we all know, a professional disinformant named Richard Doty. This interview, I remember prepping for it, and I remember having like 4 or 5 pages in my notebook filled with specific questions that I wanted to ask him. I wanted to go by information that I knew from Crash at Corona and kind of compare it with what he said. Doty's job was to spread disinformation within UFO circles, sort of let people's imagination do the rest. He was specifically tasked with making Paul Benowitz believe that there was like an impending alien threat, so that he believed these things he was seeing were in fact aliens. He said he really became friends with Paul Benowitz, and Paul Benowitz was a pilot, and Doty would assist him on these excursions to see these lights, and Doty started to see things that he couldn't explain. And they would confirm the times with the flight schedules, and it didn't match up with their sightings. So Doty started to tell us that he was in disbelief that when he would see these things. So it was really interesting because, of course, we don't know if what Doty was being told was true or not. So I really had a lot of questions for him. And of course, you have to ask yourself, how do we know if Richard Doty was told the truth? The thing is that we don't. So we really had to take this interview with a grain of salt, but it was by far one of the most interesting interviews I've ever been a part of. So he told us he saw a gray alien in a room being taped, and he was telepathically communicating with one of the government agents. And Doty, of course, wasn't supposed to see this, but he did. He told us that some of what we see is reverse engineered craft. Military aircraft can fly without lights in designated areas. That's one thing he told us. He told us that at one point there was an abductions unit he got cleared into. He told us that the bodies from the Corona crash were taken to Los Alamos because of the facility that they had there. The first debris trail, he said, was the antenna of the craft. The second craft, which he said crashed because of a storm, it messed with their electronics. There was one near Corona, which we know, and then the other one was near Horse Mesa or Capitan Mountains, I think what he said. And I remember during this interview, me and Jennifer Marshall were just in disbelief as to what he was telling us. And of course, we don't know if it's rooted in truth. It remains to be one of the most memorable interviews I've had, whether he's telling the truth or not, just to hear what was coming out of his mouth. And just in general, the whole story with Paul Benowitz is wacky. I think that after the interview with Richard Doty, it just really solidifies the idea that the intelligence community have exploited and manipulated beliefs about UFOs and supposed extraterrestrial visits. Thank you for listening to my stories. I have so many more I feel like I could share, but as you know, there's only so many hours in a day. So hopefully you enjoyed some of the ones that I shared with you tonight. Thank you to Ryan Sprague for asking me to be a part of this event. I'm really excited to watch the other presentations too. So thank you. See you around.